Good morning. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket is vertical this morning, awaiting liftoff at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is 16:06 UTC for those of you in other time zones. Welcome to our live coverage of the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with Intelsat's Galaxy 31 and 32 communication satellites from Cape Canaveral. I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of Spaceflight Now, and we appreciate you joining us. SpaceX has a 2-hour launch window today for this mission. Again, it opens at 11:06 a.m. Eastern and runs until 1:06 p.m. Eastern Time. The official launch weather forecast going into this morning's countdown called for a 90% probability of acceptable weather conditions for liftoff. This mission was originally scheduled for launch back on Tuesday, November the 8th. However, SpaceX delayed the mission 4 days to wait for Hurricane Nicole to pass through the Cape Canaveral area. The hurricane made landfall south of the Cape on the east coast of Florida early Thursday. It brought some hurricane force wind gusts to the spaceport. However, the Falcon 9 rocket was secured inside the SpaceX hangar at Pad 40 throughout the storm. And once the storm passed, SpaceX rolled the vehicle out to the pad and lifted it vertical yesterday in preparation for today's launch attempt. Again, the two spacecraft this particular Falcon 9 will be carrying into orbit are Galaxy 31 and 32. These are two C-band TV broadcasting satellites that will be covering the United States for Intelsat, distributing cable TV programming primarily to users across North America. For this mission, one thing that is unique is that SpaceX will not be attempting to recover the first stage booster. If you look closely amid the heat waves in this view of the pad, you'll note that there are no landing legs on the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. There are also no grid fins that they use for steering and stability during the descent. So this is an expendable booster on this mission. This booster has flown to space 13 times before, going for its 14th and final launch today for Intelsat. Again, SpaceX typically likes to recover these first stage boosters and reuse them. They've already had a couple of boosters reach the 14 flight milestone. This one today will be another one that reaches that 14 flight milestone. But in this case, Intelsat actually paid an additional fee, paid a premium to SpaceX in their launch contract to arrange for this mission to be expendable. So this booster will be retired from SpaceX's fleet today. Intelsat says that they wanted all of the performance from the Falcon 9's first stage booster for this mission to send these two satellites, Galaxy 31 and 32, into as high of an orbit as possible. For recovery missions, SpaceX reserves a little bit of the fuel and oxidizer on the first stage booster for the burns that are required to return that rocket to Earth for landing. But on this mission, all of the propellant on the first stage will be devoted to the mission, putting these two satellites into as high of an orbit as possible. They're actually targeting an orbit with an apogee or high point of about 60,000 kilometers. That's about 37,000 miles above the Earth. These two satellites will then use their own fuel to maneuver into a circular geostationary orbit, about 22,000 miles or 36,000 kilometers directly over the equator. And by putting these two satellites into such a high orbit, the Falcon 9 will do more of the work needed to put these satellites into their final operational orbit, reducing the fuel that the satellites actually need to consume themselves to do that work. And that translates to essentially a longer lifetime for these satellites. These satellites will have more fuel for their operational station-keeping maneuvers throughout their lifetime. And with this extra performance from the Falcon 9, the satellites will actually have enough fuel for about 18 years of operation. You'll note the countdown clock is now passing T-minus 59 minutes, so we're inside of an hour until today's launch from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Now T-minus 38 minutes, 30 seconds and counting. In the next few moments, we hope to hear word from SpaceX's launch team, whether they have pulled go or no-go for propellant loading. We're not aware of any technical issues this morning, and the weather is favorable for launch of the Falcon 9 rocket at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 16:06 UTC. If the team pulls go, propellant loading should begin in about 3 minutes' time at T-minus 35 minutes.
This is the launch director on the primary countdown net with abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
That was the voice from SpaceX Launch Control, giving the team abort instructions if needed during today's countdown. However, that is a good indication that the countdown is going to proceed this morning for a launch at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Time. SpaceX engineers are monitoring the countdown from a control center a few miles south of the pad. Now less than a minute remaining until the start of propellant loading. SpaceX will load about 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 vehicle out on pad 40 in preparation for launch at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Time with Intelsat's Galaxy 31 and Galaxy 32 communication satellites.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And there's confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch auto sequence has started. So this marks the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. And at this point, control of the countdown has passed into the hands of an automated sequencer or computer that oversees the fast-paced series of events that are needed to ready the Falcon 9 for flight today. Command of the countdown will then be transitioned over to the Falcon 9 rocket's onboard computer on the vehicle itself at T-minus 60 seconds. So right now, kerosene fuel, known as Rocket Propellant 1 or RP1, is being loaded into the first and second stages of the Falcon 9. And in parallel with that, the cryogenic liquid oxygen, which is chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero, is being loaded into the first stage. The liquid oxygen loading onto stage 2 won't begin until about T-minus 16 minutes. Everything looking good so far in this countdown at Cape Canaveral. Over the next few minutes, we expect to see some frost and ice build up on the outer skin of the first stage booster as that super cold liquid oxygen flows into the tank. The liquid oxygen tank on the first stage actually sits above the kerosene tank. So the kerosene fuel is loaded into the lowermost portion of this booster. Liquid oxygen is loaded into the tank that sits above the kerosene tank, and that's where we expect to see the frost build up over the next few minutes as that super cold fluid is loaded on board. This booster is flying for the 14th time. So you notice it's pretty dark. It has a lot of scorch and soot marks from its previous trips to space. And that bright white frost will really stand out on that black background. In this view of the Falcon 9, on either side of the vehicle are the 4 lightning protection towers. These masts are there to protect the Falcon 9 from any lightning strikes while it's vertical on the pad. Just to the right of the vehicle itself is the strongback. That's also the transporter erector arm that is used to carry the rocket from the hangar out to the pad and then raise it vertical in preparation for launch. SpaceX's countdown is now at T-minus 32 minutes, 22 seconds. Now approaching T-minus 30 minutes, we're now seeing some of the frost and vapors build up at the bottom of that liquid oxygen tank, as I talked about a couple of minutes ago, as the liquid oxygen is loaded into the vehicle. For this mission, the 2 satellites on board are the Galaxy 31 and 32 spacecraft. This picture on the right of this slide comes from Intelsat, showing the 2 satellites stacked one on top of the other, each about the size of a compact car, inside of SpaceX's payload processing facility at Cape Canaveral. You see members of the ground processing team. They're posing with these 2 stacked satellites there in the PPF at Cape Canaveral. These 2 spacecraft were built by Maxar. They're based on Maxar's 1300 class satellite platform. They have a combined weight of about 6.6 metric tons. That's 14,550 pounds, roughly. Each of the satellites a little over 3 metric tons by themselves. We've talked a little bit this morning about how this mission is utilizing a Falcon 9 rocket that will have its booster expended. So there's no landing either on the drone ship or at the Cape for the first stage this morning. This is an expendable mission for the first stage booster. And this allows the Falcon 9 to devote all of its first stage booster propellant to deploying or sending these 2 satellites into a higher orbit. So the altitude of the apogee of the transfer orbit, the egg-shaped orbit that this mission is targeting, is actually at 60,000 kilometers. It's about 37,000 miles. That's well above the typical altitude for geostationary transfer orbits, which is about 22,000 miles. And this actually makes for a more efficient transfer of these two satellites from the drop-off orbit into their final operating orbit, and reserves more fuel on the satellites themselves for a longer operating life once they become operational. Intelsat says they paid a premium to SpaceX for this expendable mission because SpaceX will lose this booster from their fleet with this flight. Intelsat has not disclosed exactly how much they paid extra for this mission when asked in a pre-launch press conference, but they have confirmed that they did pay a premium for this extra performance from the Falcon 9. The two satellites, again, Galaxy 31 and 32. Galaxy 31 is actually sitting on the bottom of this stack. Galaxy 32 is on top. Galaxy 31 replaces, once it's inner surface, Galaxy 31 will replace the Galaxy 23 spacecraft, providing C-band video relay service from 121 degrees west longitude in geostationary orbit. Galaxy 32 replaces Galaxy 17 at 91 degrees west. So these two satellites are heading into a super synchronous transfer orbit on the way to a final orbit at geostationary altitude. Once they're in that orbit, their orbital velocities will match the rate of Earth's rotation, so they'll essentially orbit the planet in lockstep with the rotation at the equator, giving these two satellites fixed coverage zones over North America. Both of these satellites are part of Intelsat's program to replace some of its aging C-band TV and video broadcast satellites. This is part of the Federal Communications Commission's initiative to repurpose a portion of the C-band radio spectrum from satellite services to 5G terrestrial broadband. And this requires satellite operators like Intelsat to order new satellites that are tuned to a different part of the C-band spectrum. And Intelsat and other companies are getting funding from 5G operators as compensation for this multi-billion-dollar effort to transition some of the C-band spectrum to 5G terrestrial broadband and to fund the development, construction, and launch of these new satellites that are tuned for that different portion of C-band spectrum to continue providing cable TV services and other video relay services over the United States. This is an artist concept from Intelsat showing what these two satellites look like in orbit once they deploy their reflectors and solar arrays. They will, again, maneuver into their final orbit, 22,000 miles over the equator, and these two satellites are roughly identical, heading for different positions, one focused more on the Pacific and the West Coast coverage, one focused on more the Atlantic region and the East Coast of the United States. Let's look at the two satellites flying on today's mission. The countdown is now passing T-minus 25 minutes. We're about 10 minutes into the process to load propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. We haven't heard any issues so far on the countdown loop. Everything looks good for launch at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Time. SpaceX's countdown now at T-minus 20 minutes and 30 seconds. In the next few moments, we expect to see the so-called big vent from the strong back out at pad 40.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
And there's confirmation that the stage 2 kerosene load is complete. So the second stage fuel tank is now full. And now we're seeing the big vent from the strong back out at pad 40. This coincides with the start of chill down or thermal conditioning of the liquid oxygen transfer line that leads up that strong back from the ground storage tank into the second stage. That transfer line that runs up that strong back needs to be brought down to cryogenic temperature, thermally conditioned essentially, before the liquid oxygen actually is loaded into the second stage, beginning in about 3 or 4 minutes. And we're seeing this purge or vent from the strong back coinciding with the start of chill down. T-minus 19 minutes and 38 seconds and counting. Parallel with this action on the second stage, loading of kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen continues down on the first stage. So here's a look at the SpaceX countdown. We've seen a couple of these actions already completed, such as the go pull for propellant loading and the start of propellant loading itself at T-minus 35 minutes. Coming up at T-minus 16 minutes will be the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage. And then at T-minus 7 minutes, the 9 Merlin engines on the bottom of the first stage will begin their chill down process. This thermally conditions the 9 M1D or Merlin 1D engines for flight. This involves flowing a little bit of the super cold liquid oxygen through those engines.
Spacecraft are on internal power.
And there's confirmation from a spacecraft operations console that the Galaxy 31 and 32 satellites nestled inside the Falcon 9 rocket's payload shroud are now transitioned to internal battery power. This configures the satellites for launch. They're now running off their onboard batteries off of the ground power supply. And they'll be operating off these batteries until they're deployed from the Falcon 9 in orbit and can unfurl their solar panels to begin recharging the batteries from solar energy. But going back to the countdown timeline briefly here, at T-minus 5.5 minutes, the first stage kerosene tank should be fully loaded. At 4.5 minutes, we should see the retraction of the strong back on the right side of the vehicle to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. That'll be visible in this view. At about T-minus 2 minutes, the Falcon 9's propellant tanks should all be fully loaded. So the liquid oxygen tanks will be the last ones filled and topped off to flight levels. That will occur at about 2 minutes prior to launch. And at T-minus 60 seconds, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown. All of the commands issued to the vehicle in the final 60 seconds will actually come from the onboard computer on the Falcon 9. Those commands include pressurization of the propellant tanks, bringing those tanks to flight pressure. At T-minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch director will verify their go for launch. And at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will command engine start to light the 9 Merlin 1D engines. And assuming those engines pass a very quick computer health check, the command will be given by the Falcon 9's onboard computer to open clamps at the bottom of the rocket, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its climb off of pad 40 for today's mission. So there's a look at the major countdown milestones today. We're at T-minus 16 minutes, 30 seconds. We should hear the call for liquid oxygen loading on the second stage. And there it is, right on time. Stage 2 liquid oxygen load is underway. So this is the final propellant tank to be filled this morning in the countdown. T-minus 12 minutes, 35 seconds, everything looking good in this countdown at Cape Canaveral as SpaceX prepares for launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with the Intelsat Galaxy 31 and 32 communication satellites for Intelsat. These two satellites are heading for a position in geostationary orbit to provide video relay services, primarily for cable TV programming across the United States. If you're just joining us, thanks for tuning in for our coverage of this launch from the Cape this morning. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. This helps us gain a larger following and a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this to as many people as possible, and that you can help out with that by hitting the like button here on our YouTube stream. You can also support our coverage by becoming a member. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from. Depending on which level you select, you can gain access to exclusive members-only video features from our coverage of space activity and launch activity at Cape Canaveral. And you'll be supporting our coverage, allowing us to continue to bring you live events like this one, and for our coverage of the wider space industry on our website at spaceflightnow.com. And one last appeal, if you want to get alerts when we're going live for launch coverage, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. SpaceX's countdown is now passing T-minus 11 minutes until liftoff. T-minus 9 minutes and 40 seconds and counting. Today's mission will be heading due east out over the Atlantic Ocean. This map shows the approximate ground track for today's launch of the Falcon 9 to place the Intelsat Galaxy 31 and 32 communications satellites into orbit. As we mentioned several times, these satellites are bound for a final position over the equator in orbit. And to reach that equatorial orbit, the Falcon 9 needs to head due east from the Cape. We've labeled the location of Space Launch Complex 40, the starting point for today's mission, here on this map. And we typically include the location of the drone ship if there's a landing planned, but for today's mission, the Falcon 9's first stage is flying without landing legs, it's flying without grid fins. There's no recovery planned of the first stage for this mission. So there's no drone ship deployed. There is a SpaceX recovery team out in the Atlantic Ocean in position to try to retrieve the two halves of the Falcon 9's payload fairing after they parachute into the sea. SpaceX also, of course, less famously, but importantly, reuses the nose cone, the payload fairing halves on the Falcon 9. So there will be an attempt to retrieve those on today's mission, but no booster recovery is on tap today. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will surpass the speed of sound in about a minute. It'll pass the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, or max Q, at 72 seconds. The first stage will burn for 2 minutes and 43 seconds. This is about 10 to 15 seconds longer than we typically see the first stage burn for missions that are going to be recovered for booster recovery. So this, again, is devoting all that fuel to the launch sequence and boosting the satellites into as high of an orbit as possible. That'll be followed by stage separation, and then shortly thereafter, the second stage engine will light for its first 2 burns to place these 2 Intelsat satellites into the supersynchronous transfer orbit. Payload fairing will jettison about 3.5 minutes after launch. The second burn of the second stage is planned at T plus 26 minutes 50 seconds. That'll be followed by payload deployment. Galaxy 32 will deploy first, followed 5 minutes later by Galaxy 31.
Engines are chilling in flight.
There's the call from SpaceX Launch Control at T minus 7 minutes. That engine chill down is underway. So this begins the process to thermally condition the 9 Merlin 1D engines at the bottom of the first stage for flight. It involves flowing a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen into that engine compartment through some of the plumbing to bring those components and that hardware down to cryogenic temperatures. This first stage booster is booster 1051. It's flying for the 14th and final time today. It debuted back on March the 2nd, 2019 with SpaceX's Demo 1 mission for the Crew Dragon spacecraft. This was the first unpiloted demonstration flight for the Crew Dragon in advance of its later flights with astronauts on board. It launched about 3 months later with Canada's RadarSat Constellation mission from Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California. Then SpaceX returned the booster to Florida, where it's been ever since, launching 10 Starlink missions to date, plus the XM radio broadcasting satellite for Sirius XM radio. So 13 missions completed for this booster, going for its 14th and final flight today. Its most recent launch was back in July the 17th, with a Starlink mission. So there you have the flight history for the Falcon 9 booster 1051. We've heard that the first stage is now fully loaded with kerosene fuel. So SpaceX has loaded about 46,000 gallons of kerosene into the Falcon 9 this morning. Liquid oxygen loading continues for about 3 more minutes.
Tanks are pressing for strong back retract. Strong back retract auto has started.
That was the call from SpaceX Launch Control. That strong back retract is underway. It'll maneuver back to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9.
Strong back retract. Stage 1, lock scope complete.
We're hearing more frequent calls from SpaceX Launch Control as the countdown passes T-minus 3 minutes. The first stage liquid oxygen load is complete. We should hear a similar call in a few moments that the second stage liquid oxygen load has been completed. And as you can see, the strong back has reclined to that angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. At liftoff, the strong back will recline further and more rapidly to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb. 2.5 minutes until launch.
Stage 2, lock flow complete.
With that call, the Falcon 9 rocket is fully loaded with propellants. About 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen have been loaded into the vehicle. Everything looking good for launch at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Time, 16:06 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. T-minus 60 seconds.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Wait for the call. Falcon 9 is in startup. The onboard computer is now controlling the countdown. One of the next steps will be the pressurization of the propellant tanks, closing of the vent valves to bring those tanks to flight pressure.
LD, go for launch.
There's the final call from SpaceX's launch director. Go for launch.
30 seconds.
T-minus 25 seconds. T-minus 20. 15. The Falcon 9 engine
seconds.
start sequence will begin at T-minus 3 seconds.
T-minus 10, 9, 8,
T-minus
7,
5,
6,
4,
5,
3,
4,
2,
3,
1.
2,
Engine start.
1.
And liftoff.
And
liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket carrying Intelsat's Galaxy 31 and 32 communications satellites from Cape Canaveral. Falcon 9 has cleared the towers at pad 40. Vehicle is now pitching downrange, heading due east from Cape Canaveral.
M1D, chamber pressure is nominal.
We're hearing nominal callouts from launch control. Chamber pressure is nominal on the first stage. T-plus 29 seconds. Rocket now climbing into some cloud cover over Florida's Space Coast here. T-plus 45 seconds. Falcon 9 has emerged from those clouds, heading downrange. Now about to pass the period of Mach 1. Mach 1 is confirmed. Falcon 9 is supersonic. Next up will be Max Q, maximum aerodynamic pressure.
Max Q.
Beautiful shot here of the contrail forming behind the Falcon 9 in its wake of the 9 1D engines. Beginning its arc downrange east from the Cape with Galaxy 31 and 32 on board.
I'm back chilling.
T-plus 1 minute 55 seconds. About 45 seconds remaining until the shutdown of the first stage engines. That'll be quickly followed by stage separation and ignition of the second stage. Now switch to onboard views from SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. These views are provided by SpaceX, showing the coast of Florida receding in the background. About 15 seconds remaining until main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
We've heard verbal confirmation now of MECO and staging and ignition of the second stage. The video should show that momentarily. The video does come with a bit of a lag from the onboard cameras from SpaceX. There's stage separation and ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine to begin its role in powering the Galaxy 31 and 32 satellites into orbit. Again, that first stage booster will not be recovered today. It is an expendable rocket today with no landing legs, no grid fins, after devoting all of its propellant to the task of boosting the Galaxy 31 and 32 satellites into as fast and high of a trajectory as possible.
Fairing separation confirmed.
Intelsat paid a premium for that service, for expending the Falcon 9 to get all the performance out of that rocket as possible. We've heard the call of payload fairing separation. Should see that here in the onboard camera view. And there's payload fairing jettison, revealing the stack of Galaxy 31 and 32 on the Falcon 9 rocket. Galaxy 32 on top, Galaxy 31 on the lower position. We've also heard a call that the downrange telemetry station in Bermuda is tracking the rocket, T+4 minutes.
Trajectory is nominal.
Now 5.5 minutes into flight, about halfway through this first burn of the second stage engine, accelerating Intelsat's Galaxy 31 and 32 satellites to orbital velocity. This first burn will place the satellites into a very low altitude parking orbit.
Trajectory is nominal.
We're still hearing occasional reports from SpaceX Launch Control. The last indicated that the trajectory of the second stage is as expected as the clock passes T+7 minutes and change.
stage 2 FTS is saved.
Expected loss of signal, Cape Canaveral.
MVAC shutdown.
And we've heard the call of MVAC stage engine cutoff.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And that call, nominal orbit confirms that the Falcon 9 has placed a satellite burn that will actually boost these two satellites into a much higher orbit. That burn is expected to begin at T plus 26 minutes and 50 seconds. Will last a little more than a minute. And then deployment of Galaxy 32 is expected at 33 minutes after launch, followed 5 minutes later at T plus 38 minutes by separation of Galaxy 31.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
13 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on the right, and view of the empty launch pad at Cape Canaveral. Breeze at liftoff. Launch occurred at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 16:06 UTC, at the opening of today's 2-hour launch window. On the left is a map from SpaceX showing the location of the second stage, now over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, heading toward the west coast of Africa. Will actually be passing over Cape Verde and then over Africa. And the ignition of the second stage engine for its second burn is targeted in about 13 minutes or so, at T plus 26 minutes 50 seconds. And at that point, the rocket will actually be flying over the equator. Burn is timed when the rocket intersects the equator in order to boost the two satellites, Galaxy 31 and 32 for Intelsat, into a much higher orbit. And then maneuver also does a little bit of a plane change to reduce the inclination of the orbit. That's why it's timed and scheduled for the moment, or roughly the moment, that the rocket's trajectory intersects the equator. T plus 23 minutes, 27 seconds into the flight. This map provided by SpaceX shows the location of the second stage currently near the west coast of Africa. It's on a trajectory that will take it over the Gulf of Guinea and then out over southern Africa in the next few minutes. We're about 3 minutes from the expected ignition time for the second stage for its second burn. This is an orbit boost burn that will place the Intelsat Galaxy 31 and 32 satellites into a much higher orbit. The rocket and the payloads are currently in a very low orbit, just a couple hundred miles or so above Earth. The second burn will reshape that orbit and send the apogee or high point of that orbit all the way out to about 37,000 miles or about 60,000 kilometers.
Acquisition of signal, go on.
We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the second stage of the Falcon 9 is now in range of the ground station in Libreville, Gabon. That's on the southwestern part of Africa. So this timeline shows some of the major events of this launch. We've already passed many of these events, but coming up, I'll draw your attention to T plus 26 minutes, 50 seconds. That's the expected ignition time for the second stage Merlin vacuum engine for a burn that is expected to last about 70 seconds, cutting off at 28 minutes. And then the rocket will coast about 5.5 minutes until the deployment of Galaxy 32, which is riding on the upper part of the dual payload stack on this mission. Once that satellite is clear, the rocket will actually fire thrusters, reorient itself to point a different direction to release Galaxy 31 at 38 minutes, 41 seconds. So we're about 90 seconds now from the start of the second stage's second burn.
Vac ignition.
We've now seen the ignition of the second stage engine a few moments ago. You can see the nozzle engine bell beginning to glow red hot. This is normal as the super hot exhaust comes out of that Merlin vacuum engine. You can see the speed on the lower right, that speed meter heading up, increasing, now passing 31,000 kilometers per hour. This burn adding velocity to the rocket and the satellites to set the stage for payload deployment in a few minutes' time.
MVAC shutdown.
And there's verbal confirmation of Merlin vacuum engine shutdown.
Nominal orbit insertion.
Expect to see that visual confirmation from the onboard camera, and they're shut down with a few seconds lag, as expected from the onboard camera. SpaceX Launch Control has confirmed a nominal orbit insertion, so the rocket achieved the expected supersynchronous transfer orbit. Again, the target altitude for apogee, or the high point of this elliptical orbit, was about 37,000 miles, or about 60,000 kilometers, and based on the report we just heard from SpaceX Launch Control, that altitude, that apogee, was achieved. Now about 5 minutes remaining until the deployment of the first of the 2 satellites on this mission.
Acquisition of signal, hard to be stopped.
Now T plus 31 minutes, 48 seconds into today's mission. We're about a minute and a half remaining until the separation of the first of the 2 satellites on today's flight. Here's a recap of what's on board this Falcon 9 rocket. The 2 satellites are Galaxy 31 and 32. These are C-band TV broadcasting and video relay satellites for Intelsat that are destined to cover the United States. They're built by Maxar, based on Maxar's 1300 class satellite platform. On the right, you see a picture of these 2 satellites as they appeared before launch inside a SpaceX payload processing facility at Cape Canaveral, with members of the ground team there posing for scale. Galaxy 32 is actually on the upper position of this stack. Galaxy 31 is on the bottom position. So we'll see G32 or Galaxy 32 separate first, followed 5 minutes later by Galaxy 31. The total combined mass of these 2 satellites at launch, fully fueled, was 6.6 metric tons. That's about 14,500 pounds. And of course, we saw that SpaceX did not attempt to recover the first stage booster on this mission. That allowed the first stage to devote all of its fuel to placing these 2 satellites into as high of an orbit as possible. So these 2 satellites are on board the Falcon 9. We should hear confirmation of the Galaxy 32 separation in less than 30 seconds. We'll stand by for that. We're We're seeing onboard camera views from SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. We should see Galaxy 32 deploy first in just a few moments.
Confirmed separation on first payload.
For the verbal confirmation of Galaxy 32's separation. Should see that on the onboard camera view here shortly. And there you see Galaxy 32 flying free of the Falcon 9 rocket as the vehicle soars over southern Africa. That satellite catching sun against the blackness of space. You can see that satellite actually reflected in the solar panel of its companion, Galaxy 31, here, still attached to the Falcon 9 rocket. Galaxy 31 will be deployed in about 4.5 minutes. These satellites will each begin their own activation procedures after deployment. They'll take command of their propulsion system, prime their propulsion systems for in-orbit maneuvers. They will unfurl their solar panels and deploy the reflectors, and ultimately make their way into geostationary orbit using onboard propulsion. Those maneuvers for orbit maneuvers to reach geostationary orbit will take about 2 weeks. Galaxy 31 and 32 will enter commercial service early next year.
Acquisition of signal, Maldives.
So with Galaxy 32 now flying free of the second stage of the Falcon 9, we're about 2 minutes from the deployment of Galaxy 31. Here's a cool view of Galaxy 32 there in the background moments ago with the Falcon 9's Merlin vacuum engine. The Falcon 9 has essentially turned itself around about 180 degrees to set up for deployment of Galaxy 31. We've heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that Galaxy 31 has deployed. We should see that here in the onboard camera view in a matter of seconds. And there, Galaxy 31 has deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. This satellite, like its companion, by Maxar. Galaxy 31, a 3 satellite, launched back in 2003. It's an aging Intelsat's video relay. And Galaxy 32 will be replacing Galaxy 17, which launched back in 2007. Both of these satellites will be providing C-band video relay services over North America, with missions expected to last at least 18 years. Now, 40 minutes, 30 seconds since the launch. Here's another view of Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, which was the starting point for today's mission. Again, we saw the Falcon 9 take off at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 16:06 UTC, with Galaxy 31 and 32 on board for Intelsat. The first stage fired for more than 2.5 minutes, shut down its engines, and jettisoned. It fell back into the Atlantic Ocean. It was not recovered. This is a rare expendable Falcon 9 mission for SpaceX. This was at the request of Intelsat, which says it paid a premium to SpaceX for this expendable mission to eke out all of the performance from the Falcon 9 rocket as possible, to place these satellites into as high of an orbit as possible. And that allows the satellites to actually reserve some of their propellants that would otherwise have been used for orbit raising maneuvers to get into their final operational orbits. Instead, that propellant will be used for station keeping and for maintaining the satellite's position in space over the course of a missions lasting 15 to 18 years, according to Intelsat. And that long life is enabled by the decision to use an expendable Falcon 9 for today's launch. We saw Galaxy 32 separate from the Falcon 9 first at 33 minutes after launch. That was followed about 5 minutes later by separation of Galaxy 31. With this mission, Galaxy 31 and 32 now in the books, let's look ahead at what we'll be covering over the next few days and few weeks. The next launch that will be streaming live is on November the 16th. That's the scheduled date right now for the launch of NASA's Artemis 1 moon mission, which has been delayed several months now, waiting for the resolution to hydrogen leaks that have been detected in the fueling system down at the base of the core stage, as well as hurricane-related delays. Hurricane Nicole made landfall in Florida last week, or earlier this week actually, caused some very minor damage around the spaceport and on the rocket and Orion spacecraft out at Pad 39B, which rode out the storm on the pad. There were some hurricane force wind gusts measured at different heights in the lightning towers out at Pad 39B early Thursday, with Hurricane Nicole just to the south of the Space Center. But none of the wind constraints were exceeded, according to NASA. And after teams complete some final inspections and minor repairs over the weekend, NASA hopes to maintain the schedule and make a launch attempt for this Space Launch System moon rocket early on November the 16th. That is on Wednesday morning. So we'll be covering that countdown if it remains on schedule, beginning late Tuesday night live from Kennedy Space Center, and we'll be carrying you through that entire launch attempt and countdown, hopefully culminating in liftoff, the long-awaited liftoff of the Artemis 1 moon mission from Kennedy Space Center. This mission is carrying the Orion spacecraft on an unpiloted or uncrewed mission around the moon, and it's designed to pave the way for astronauts to actually strap into the Orion spacecraft and on top of the Space Launch System for the Artemis 2 mission in about 2 years or so. That will be the first crewed mission to the moon since 1972. If that mission goes forward with Artemis 2, that hinges, of course, on the outcome of Artemis 1. Also on November the 16th, SpaceX will be in action out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with the launch of another batch of Starlink satellites. This mission is designated Starlink 2-4. It'll be carrying a batch of Starlink internet satellites into orbit from the West Coast. And then SpaceX has another couple of launches planned from Florida on November the 20th and 21st, back-to-back dates. A Falcon 9 on November the 20th is scheduled to launch with Intelsat's 10B, a Intelsat broadband satellite providing primarily in-flight internet connectivity and maritime internet service for airplanes and ships. That Intelsat 10B satellite is scheduled to launch November the 20th from Pad 40, the same pad we saw in use today at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And notably, that mission will also utilize an expendable Falcon 9 booster. So another expendable Falcon 9 scheduled to launch in 8 days. Then the following day, on November the 21st, SpaceX is scheduled to launch its next space station resupply mission with a Dragon cargo capsule from Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center, also on board a Falcon 9 rocket. That mission will be carrying several tons of supplies and experiments to the International Space Station. Here's a live shot of Pad 39A, where that mission is scheduled to take off in 9 days on November the 21st. We'll be streaming all of these launches live. We'll be covering them on our website at spaceflightnow.com as well. And before we sign off, we'll leave you with one last look at Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where we saw the Falcon 9 launch with Intelsat's Galaxy 31 and 32 satellites at 11:06 a.m. Eastern Time. Also, before we leave, we'll ask you and invite you one more time to become a member of our YouTube channel, because that really keeps the gears turning at Spaceflight Now and enables us to keep bringing you live coverage like this for launches from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Kennedy Space Center. If you join, depending on which membership level you select, you can gain access to bonus members-only video features that we have for our YouTube members. And you'll be supporting our coverage as well. So until next time, the next scheduled launch we'll be covering here on YouTube is the Artemis 1 mission on Wednesday morning. Our coverage will actually be beginning Tuesday evening from Kennedy Space Center in advance of that launch attempt. I'm Stephen Clark, reporting on the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, a successful launch in the books today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.